Good afternoon, listeners. This is another episode of CivicCast, a podcast for engaged citizens, and we're your hosts, Jeremiah Kimmelman and Jason Denizak. This episode, we're talking with Cathy Deng, and she's a civic hacker and data consultant based in Chicago, Illinois, and recently has come out with a pretty fantastic project called Expungio. And it really helps folks in Cook County with juvenile records kind of kick off that expungement process. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Was that kind of the intro, or is there any little bit of flavor you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's about it. Expungio started in January, so it's still a fairly new civic app.
Awesome. Well, something that struck me is I wasn't really aware of the problem of juvenile records. So, how did you become aware of this problem, and where did you really get the idea to come up with the concept of Expungio?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, before working on Expungio, I had no knowledge of juvenile expungement or like the extent of the, I guess, youth incarceration problem here in Chicago. And it actually wasn't my app idea, which I think is actually one of the coolest parts of Expungio. It wasn't like an app that a civic hacker came up with. I worked with this group called the MICVA Challenge, and they're a bunch of youth who are really civically engaged, and they had a bunch of breakout groups that researched all these different issues in Chicago. So there was like a health council, there was an education council, and there was a juvenile justice council. And the youth in the juvenile justice council, they were the ones that realized that there were so many kids getting arrested every year. In Chicago, it's about 25,000 youth arrests every year, which is outrageous.
That's huge.
Very, very few expungements. I think every year it's around like 500, 600 records are actually expunged. And the really sad thing is that the vast majority of those 25,000 arrests can be expunged. So they really wanted to have a digital tool that could raise awareness about expungement and kick off the process.
Sure. So just to set a little bit more context for listeners, because like I said, I didn't actually know a lot of this before I started researching your project. What are the consequences of someone who doesn't have their record expunged? Like what does that mean for that person as they go about their life?
Yeah. So it could be more difficult to find employment. It could be more difficult to get housing benefits, affordable housing. It can be more difficult to get scholarships or get into schools, things like that. So it has pretty broad effects.
Totally, yeah. So, what's also striking to me about Expungio is that it kind of highlights a social problem, like an information problem. People are not aware of how this process works or what kind of remedies they might have. And it's not necessarily clear that a technology product would solve that. So as you're thinking about Expungio, or as you were working with these students and they had the idea for a digital tool, what kind of led them to prioritize a digital tool over maybe some other types of solutions?
So I think it's definitely less about the technology. It is much more of a communication problem. But that being said, having a digital medium, you can communicate things in a different way than you could, say, on paper, on a brochure. Mm-hmm. And effectively, the problem we found that all of the existing resources, it was the existing online resources, it was essentially treating the web as like a paper pamphlet that you handed out to someone. It would be like a 25-page PDF. And that's just not easy for someone to digest, and you kind of lose the core message that's like, hey, like you should get your record expunged, and you're probably eligible to do so. And so the thing that a digital tool allows us to do is it allows us to interact with the user and give them small chunks of information at a time, and it also allows us to tailor information to different users.
Can you give maybe an example of how that tailoring might change the way someone can navigate this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So figuring out whether or not you're eligible for expungement is actually pretty complicated. So when I was doing the initial research, I worked with an attorney from LAF, which is a pro bono legal aid foundation in Chicago. And I noticed that she had all of these flow charts for figuring out if people were eligible for expungement. So essentially a client would come in and she would ask them a series of questions to like figure out where they were in the flow chart. So based on what you were arrested for and what age you were and what age you are now, you kind of have different situations. Like you might be eligible right now, you might be eligible when you're 18, you might be eligible when you're done with probation. So there are kinds of like different kinds of information to serve up to different people based on the specifics of their background.
So it sounds like the process itself can be pretty complex in a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
But yeah, beyond the process itself, I think the words that we use to talk about the process can be confusing, and more so than they have to be. I mean, the word expungement, for example, I think I've said it more in preparing for this episode than I have in the rest of my life combined. So what kind of goes into breaking down these processes and reformulating them in ways that can be understood by the people who can benefit from them?
Yeah.
You're able to start with some of that information, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you definitely touched on probably the number one challenge of Expungia, which is how do we communicate this information? And I think it's a particularly difficult problem because it wouldn't do it justice to just simplify everything into, you know, the most, I guess, general cases or the most general terms, because there are very specific legal policies that apply. So we're kind of walking this balance between having information that's legally accurate and legally precise versus user friendly. So it is a big challenge, and a major thing to tackle, I think, would be definitely the vocabulary. Things like expungement and like criminal record versus juvenile record. We found that a lot of people weren't clear on that distinction. Just that, and also the intricacies of all of the policies and what leads to another. So that was a lot of the work, and I think is especially difficult in Expungio because we had a limit to how far we could simplify the information. Yeah,
in the app, for example, on the website, you use the word rap sheet, which I'm sure isn't the official legal term necessarily, but it's something that spoke to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had no idea what a rap sheet was, but I worked with youth to screen all of the language on the website and just make sure that it made sense to them. And to them, rap sheet is something that everyone knows about.
Go ahead, Jeremiah.
I think it's interesting because I think this idea of kind of helping people understand the legalese that governs our life is really difficult, and we don't always do a great job of it. So what kind of tips might you give to someone engaging in a similar kind of project where there's a body of law that is pretty important for regular people to understand? Like, can you walk us through the process maybe in a way that someone else can replicate it?
Yeah, so I think in this kind of situation, it's not like you take step one, you take step two, you take step three, and like, there we go, we have a simple explanation. I found that what really worked for us was having fresh eyes. So a lot of these resources, they're written by people at legal aid organizations or written by people who are really well versed. And I actually feel like it was kind of an advantage to the project that I had zero knowledge of juvenile expungement coming in. So I had one pair of eyes, and then you could get feedback from, other people in the civic hacking community who also may not know these issues as intimately as, say, a lawyer would. And then I think the second biggest thing outside of having fresh eyes is just iterating, like constantly getting feedback from people and then constantly iterating. Because the thing with Expungio is that, yeah, we say we launched in January, but it wasn't like, we put out a finished product in January. It's like it's constantly been changing based on the feedback of the attorney I've been working with. And she'll, fill me in on what mistakes people have made in understanding the information in Expungio, and we'll change the information accordingly.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about this overall collaborative process because I think that's the point that maybe other people listening to this podcast might be able to take away or apply to another domain. Maybe instead of expunging criminal records, it's how to negotiate a water bill or a sewer bill, for example, or any one of these other sticking points in the way that people interact with their cities currently. So what was that collaboration process? There was already this organization, the MICVA Challenge, that was doing some of this work. What did the actual working collaboration look like?
Yeah, it was actually really cool how it was split out. So we had all of the youth at the MICVA Challenge, and they did a lot of thinking about, I guess, the shortcomings of Expungio as it exists and things that we could do to improve Expungio. And then the attorney I worked with, she really ensured that everything was legally precise and accurate, and they're actually the ones who are taking all of the people who are going through Expungio and entering their information. She's actually the one who speaks with them and actually helps them fill out their forms and apply for expungement. And then I was the one that kind of worked on, I guess, the information design and the actual coding of the app. So it's pretty cool in that we had pretty separate roles, but roles that all depended on each other. And the way we all got connected actually was through Smart Chicago. So I think for Expungio, it is really important to have like this existing network of people that could, make intros. Like, hey, I have an app idea, but I don't have a developer. Like, oh, like, here's a developer I can intro you to. Like, just having that kind of network as a foundation in a city, I think was really helpful for Expungio.
So if we could just kind of boil this down into a recipe, it sounds like involve the people who are going to be the ultimate users of this application.
Mm-hmm.
Find a domain expert who is going to be able to talk to it about the technical and the more precise parts of it, and then involve the technology people and the people who could actually build the product and have everyone collaborating throughout the development process. Is that a good takeaway? And then I love the role of the Smart Chicago Collaborative too, in that you have this organization working in a community that's able to make some of these connections between different groups of people. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. The interesting thing to me in all of this is products and things that you build, you can make something as simple as possible, but are people actually going to use it? And how do you get it in front of people so that they're aware of it? If you're starting with essentially an information challenge and people unaware of this process that can help them, you simplify the process into a product, but how do you make them aware of that? And have you seen success so far with Expungio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is the problem with a lot of civic apps nowadays, where I guess in theory and like in a perfect world with perfect information, it would be great if we had these tools and people access them. But I think in reality, a lot of what comes out of the civic hacking community just kind of stays in the civic hacking community. Like people who are really interested in civic tech know about it, but not people outside of civic tech. And so we've been very acutely aware of this. And I think one of the most helpful things for Expungio is we actually have MICVA doing outreach constantly. So since probably around like April, May, all that we've been doing for Expungio has been kind of like public outreach and getting the word out. And we're actually about to start an ad campaign soon to put information about Expungio on the L and on stickers. and in schools so that, people can actually use it. Because, yeah, that's the real limit of how effective any civic app can be.
Totally. Do you have an indication thus far of maybe how, not trying to look into the deep abyss of expungiometrics, but like, do you have any indication of how many people have been able to use it, or maybe just the awareness it's generated around the possibility that people can have their juvenile records expunged?
Yeah, totally. So I think metrics and how to measure the efficacy of expungio is actually a very interesting topic. And the easiest metric to come out with is kind of this like awareness metric, like how many people are visiting expungio. And that has been, I think, between 11,000 and 12,000 since
Wow.
we launched in January, which has been great, but that's also a metric that's pretty limited because you don't know to what extent it's just, people in the civic tech community versus people who are actually using expungio. As far as people who have filled out forms, I haven't checked back in a while, but I would guess that it's in the hundreds right now, probably under 500. And it's also interesting because numbers like that, you have to think what you're evaluating it against. So in the past, there have been 500 expungements in an entire year, just, without resources like expungio. So against that metric, it's kind of like, oh, wow, like expungio is, sending in lots of forms. But then I think it's really important in civic tech projects to keep in mind like kind of the bigger picture behind these metrics that you're comparing against, which is like there are 25,000 kids arrested every year. It's like I think that's the ultimate number that we're comparing against.
Totally. And so, I think I do a lot of work here in San Francisco with the San Francisco Brigade, and one thing that I see is, developers who don't know how to find these domain experts. And so they kind of build things in a vacuum, if you will. And then also people, who are listening to the podcast right now aren't necessarily considering themselves technical, but want to kind of work on challenges and solutions like this. Do you have any advice you might give to either of those people if those networks might not exist in the cities they're currently in?
In the cities that they're currently in, oh, wow, that's actually a very good question. I personally would look for kind of umbrella organizations. So not even necessarily like Smart Chicago if your city doesn't have a Smart Chicago. But for example, in Chicago, there's the Chicago Community Trust, which is actually where Smart Chicago is housed. And it's kind of this umbrella organization that works with a lot of other nonprofits underneath it. And I think those kinds of places are a good place to go.
Excellent. Well, we try to keep our shows to about 20 minutes, so we have about 2 minutes left. I guess, do you have any concluding thoughts or maybe share what's next after Expungio?
Yeah, so I think what's cool about expungio is that it's not something that's limited to Illinois or even something that's limited to juvenile expungement. I actually see it much less as like a tool and much more as like a way of thinking about how to package information about services. It has been exciting because people in other states are adapting expungio, and I've been excited to see that they're not just, keeping it for juvenile expungement. They're kind of expanding it to other things, like they're expanding it to criminal expungement in other states. So right now there's an expungio in Louisiana, there's one in Maryland, and I think they're in the works in Colorado and California. So that's what I'm currently pumped about.
Excellent. Where could people go to track some of that information on Expungio as it develops further and maybe outside of Chicago?
I would say, I hate to say this because not everyone knows GitHub, but if you do use GitHub, you can see who has forked Expungio and see work that's actively in development. And I guess I personally should, update Expungio and, make it more visible that, it is something that's adaptable. It's not something that's only limited to Illinois, and that it is something that other people are taking and running with.
Great. Well, we could definitely add those to the show notes as well, any URLs related to that, both the GitHub and anything else you want to pass on.
Yeah, I'll send those over.
Excellent. Well, I think that'll wrap up for this episode of CivicCast. This has been our wonderful talking with you. This is our guest, Cathy Deng, developer of Expungio. And as always, CivicCast is your podcast for engaged citizens. We're your hosts, Jason Denizak and Jeremiah Kimmelman. We bring you conversations with the most creative minds at the forefront of improving the urban experience in the 21st century. Each show, we do our best to bring you fresh ideas in civic technology, ways that you could get involved and help out. We focus on creative intervention and empathetic urbanism in bite-sized chunks of 20 minutes or less. We value any feedback that you have, so please get in touch with us either on Twitter @CivicCast, or you can watch us on the web, civiccast.us. You can also subscribe to the audio podcast on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Until next time.